Mixing with Mike mixing tip, setting up a bass chorus effect. Bass is probably one of the more difficult instruments to put an effect on because if you try to put reverb on bass, the low frequency energy doesn't really image that well on its own, and things like reverb have a tendency to even skew the imaging more. So it can be difficult to kind of get a bass to set up that way. And one of the primary ways that that you can get a bass to sort of image or center well is by using sort of a chorus effect on the bass. And there are many ways of doing this that are kind of, maybe a little bit outside of the box and somewhat are just, kind of some basic things that have been, brought down from devices that people have created. So I'm going to start there with that. One of the most common ways or uses of the Roland Dimension D, which is basically like a chorus effect. I'm not even sure that they classify it, is just as like a sort of very simple chorus effect that doesn't sound very chorusy. One of the keys to making a bass kind of not be too fuzzy or weird or smeared across the spectrum is to minimize the amount of modulation. And this is something that the Dimension D is really brilliant at. So it's a really cool device, just like 4 buttons. You can hit them in any combinations, and they will give you subtle different characteristics. But I want to start with just a simple bass sound on its own, and this is the basic chorus effect here. And what this does is it helps to create a subtle spreading effect to the sound. And sometimes this can work really, really, really well in terms of taking and shaping the bass down below a grouping of instruments. And it happens to work pretty well inside of like an R&B track. So let's listen to this kind of. Go through a couple different options. That sits a lot better. It's really important, I think, especially with bass, to audition effects in the context of a track. And that's like one way. And what it does is, like, the way I kind of envision working with the bass, especially in a track like this, is you sort of want the bass to be sort of rounded, sit low in the speaker, and sort of spread underneath things. So sometimes when the bass is like a little bit too dense, this can kind of be a cool way of doing it. Now, if you don't have the Dimension D and you have the Waves plugins bundle, another plugin that is a really cool one for creating this type of effect is a doubler. Now, this is like what I call like the static chorus effect. Static chorus effect is where there's no modulation. And the way that you sort of create the chorusing effect, we're going to start with a sort of shortish delay, 2 separate delays on each side. I'm going to take the gain here. I'm going to bring it up here so there's no direct signal. And all we have is a little bit of retune by a few cents on either side. So this might even be a little bit much here. So I'm going to make it +3, -3. No depth, so no modulation. So even though there's a rate here. So what we have is, by shifting the pitch a little bit on the left and the right, this is a trick that used to be used for sort of smoothing out vocals that maybe were a little bit pitchy. And you would mix that in with the original signal, and it would sort of smear or skew the sense of pitch and pitch variation and smooth out the vocal. But it also can work quite well for a bass. And then you can set the delay time according to, you can hear how it kind of shifts the tone. So here, this has a minimum delay setting here, so I'm going to kind of shift it. Usually like to keep the delays a little bit offset. And then that helps to shift the effect wider, so it's not sitting so exactly centered. So this gives you a little bit of a perception of the width of it. And this sort of has a sort of what I would call like a downward triangulating effect. Like sometimes like on a vocal, what this will do is it'll snap the vocal right forward. Like if you have like two stereo delays that are like slightly different in timings and pan hard left and right, it creates sort of a slap effect that sort of pulls the vocal forward in the mix. And this does a similar thing with the bass, but it kind of shifts it a little bit downward in the process of doing it. And if you want to kind of shape this into an individual thing, this is also kind of cool where you can kind of take and shape, the top and the bottom here. So you can kind of focus the energy into a more particular area. So we can skew it a little bit more towards the low end. And this will shift it a little bit more downward. Or we can add a little bit of air into it. And this can add a little bit of presence or air to the bass. You can also use like a sort of standard chorus effect, and so what I'll do is I'll just kind of call up one here a little in our modulation section here, and let's just kind of call up just like a standard air chorus effect, so nothing special here. You could also use a pedal effect. Pedal effects are also quite good for working with something like this, as they're designed more for instruments like that. But here is something we can do here, and because we have it on a send, we'll make it 100%. And I think as long as you keep the depth from going too wide, then it won't start to sound too chorusy. And to smooth it out, you want to start with a slower rate. So sometimes it's worth exaggerating the effect to get the rate that you want, and then kind of work. And then you can work in the depth just to kind of mix in the right amount of it. And you can also play with the phase on this particular plugin to kind of get it to get the chorusing effect to kind of spread a little bit more, if you like. One thing that I kind of caution in working with things like this is to mono up the effect. This can sometimes be used to add like a tonal character or difference in the sound if you keep the modulation and rate light, but it has a tendency to usually to smear the bass, make it less distinguishable. So you can hear the smears the sound of the bass, or when it's spread, it'll have a different character which sort of lifts it and kind of moves it forward. So there's many ways to kind of work with this type of thing, but these are some basic ideas. As I said, pedal effects are really good for this type of thing. One other thing that you may want to do is you may want to use a pedal effect on the insert, in which case you would use the wet-dry control. I would suggest you use a mono to stereo, gives you more control. My tendency is to split it off into a send-return configuration, and then you have complete control because I can equalize the return and do with it and shape it whatever way, compress it, do anything I want and keep the dry signal completely independent. So from a signal flow perspective and a mixing perspective, that will have a tendency to make more sense. All right, there you have it. A couple of quick mixing ideas or mixing tips on setting up a bass chorus effect.